Today we're reviewing Divine Rivals and Ruthless Vows by Rebecca Ross. Pretty excited for this. It exceeded my expectations and also wasn't what I expected. So it was kind of made for a really interesting read, and I think this book gets talked about a lot with the synopsis not being overly accurate, and what people think the book is about is not like overly accurate. So it took me a while to actually pick this up and read it. It had been on my TBR for quite a while. I'm glad I waited because I was able to just read Ruthless Vows right away, and that's nice about this is that it is like a completed duology, and it was just really good, and like I said, it exceeded my expectations. I think I gave this like the Divine Rivals, so I'll start with the Divine Rivals. I gave this, I think, like a 4.5 out of 5 on like a star system, so just to make it easy. I don't think the ratings really matter because they're just my opinion, but for me, this wasn't a full 5 because there were just things that I didn't really like, and these are going to be more like personal taste, but they're there. So it wasn't like a 5 out of 5, but still an amazing read. I would still recommend this book. My biggest reason I think that, and I mean, this isn't the author's fault or anything, it's just like, I would say my ratings are more of like my emotions and feelings and experience of the book, and this was a 4.5 out of 5 just because I feel like I have not seen anyone talk about how sad these books are. Like there are so many moments and sprinklings of very depressing, sad, heavy weight in this book that I'm surprised I haven't really seen anyone go into talking about that. It honestly felt like it was a bit of a whirlwind of shame and grief and sadness and guilt and depression, and it's just surprising how much it's also not really dealt with in the book. So for me, I just felt like, I think I even wrote in my review, like, I don't understand how Iris, the main female character, is living her day-to-day life at this point. If I were in her shoes, I'd probably just be curled up in the corner, barely getting by. So that was my only like really big thing. And it's not like this is so sad you can't read it. I'm sure there are much more like heartbreaking, really, really sad books. I was just surprised at how much sadness there was and how depressing it could be, just because I wasn't expecting that. And the next few things are kind of things that I was told about the book that I had seen. So this obviously isn't necessarily true, but this book was marketed to me as like an enemies to lovers fantasy. I don't really think that's what this is. It's more, if anything, it's rivals to lovers, kind of. And it's definitely not a fantasy, in my opinion. Like, yes, there are some magical elements, but not really. It's not enough, in my opinion, for it to be a fantasy book. If anything, I felt like it was more of a historical romance with some magical elements, like magical realism, I guess. I don't know if it would fall under that category, but I don't know. It just didn't really feel like fantasy to me when I was reading it. Heavy on the romance, though. I will say that was definitely there. And this always has me questioning whether I should bother with the synopsis of books and just like going blind. And I honestly, the more I keep talking about this in these videos, I do think I'm just gonna go in blind to these books because, and kind of maybe talk about what I think it could potentially be about based on what I'm seeing, but not what everyone else thinks or what the back of the book says, because I feel like I get misled and I'm just so all over the place with like expectations. And yeah, this book was just not what I thought it would be, and it worked out in this sense, but yeah, I was not prepared for how sad it was, so that was a big thing to consider. If you are someone who is a mood reader, I would say read it, pick it up when you want to actually experience more of a historical romance, but also feelings of sadness and like longing and grief. The other reason, and this ties into the book itself being kind of sad, the other reason I didn't give this a 5 out of 5 is because I actually don't think I would reread it, which is a big thing for me when I'm reading something like basically saying it's perfect. Yeah, it was heavy for me, and that's just not something that I necessarily feel like I need to reread over and over again. Who knows? I just don't think I will. I don't know if it was just because in my mind, for whatever reason, they write love letters to each other. The main male character and the main female character, they write love letters to each other, which is beautiful and it's sweet and adorable and I love them. I thought it was incredible, but there was one moment where I was thinking to myself that if they were texts, it would, like, as in present time text messages, that would probably make me cringe if I was reading some of that. So I wish I wouldn't have thought that, because it kind of started ruining the letters for me, unfortunately. Hopefully that doesn't ruin it for you now that I've said that. But the other thing with that was that their love is beautiful and I love their love story. However, the book was giving a bit YA, which is fine. I think it is considered YA, and their love story, just, they are young, they're like 18. So for me, that was a little bit like, I don't know, just not my favorite part of the book. You could tell that their love felt young. It felt like young love, and it was great. It's just not what I necessarily was looking for in a book either at that moment. Again, none of these things make the book bad. This is just how my experience of the book was, and I don't think they ruined the book at all. It's a great story. It's really well written. These are just things that weren't my favorite. I do think the innocence of their love really helps contrast all that's happening as far as the actual like war and propaganda and things happening around them. I think the innocence and the purity of their love is really sweet. So that part is quite nice, the way it contrasts with the rest of the story. It just made me think that I really need recommendations from people that are not YA. I need to get into other books. I have read a lot of YA recently, and I just want to experience other books that aren't YA, I guess is what I'm saying. So if you have any recommendations, let me know. On the parts that I did like, I really did like Iris and Roman. I thought their love story, like I said, was beautiful. I love the letters, I love the magical typewriters, and the actual like story between the two of them and their character development through it. I really enjoyed that. I also like that Iris, again, is like a smart, strong female main character. I really enjoyed that. And for me, this was a little bit different in the sense that it took me a long time to read these books. I put them off for a long time, and I wish I wouldn't have, because they are really good, so I would recommend them in that sense. The thing that I think I liked the most about the first book is that it's almost like you're watching a movie in your head, which I don't usually experience that with too many books, but I literally could picture everything in this book. I felt like it would make an incredible movie, and that would be pretty amazing if they did turn it into one, but that's how it felt reading it. So I feel like you can read it quite quickly because it just feels like you're right there with them, which I love when an author can do that. So this book, in my opinion, is really well done. This was back in March. I was having some struggles with books, but this book actually really sucked me in. It was the first book in a while that actually kept me up while I was reading instead of falling asleep while I was reading. And it was just a really good read. Like, I don't know how else to explain that, but because there were things that I was able to guess correctly about what was going to happen in the plot, but then there were other things that I didn't, which I love having that mix of being surprised, being right, like all those things. It was just an incredible reading experience, even though it was like heavy on the sadness. All in all, this book had me feeling basically all of my feelings, which I haven't had in a while with a book either, so I really enjoyed that, because I think that's one of the best parts about reading, especially fictional books, is when you can experience all of your feelings just from words on a page. It was so well written. I loved Iris. I loved their love story. I was hoping there was going to be more like magical elements, just because I was under the impression that this was more heavily fantasy, but she wrapped up the first book really well, and I was very excited to go into the second book. I think I started it immediately, so that was really good. I always like when the ending is really satisfying, but you're ready and wanting to read the next book. You're not like, oh, I'm gonna hold off and wait on that. It was like, no, I need to read this now. The other thing I truly loved, and you'll see this more like when I'm talking about, I'll talk about Ruthless Vows too, but I felt like Rebecca Ross did a really good job demonstrating the kind of choices you'd have to make in a time of war and how difficult those choices would be, which is also why this book is very emotional. But it goes beyond just a love story, and like how love can withstand so many things. I cannot get over how beautiful their love story is for being 18 years old. I was very much like enthralled. I was rooting for them the entire time, which is something that I think is really important when you're reading a romance, is that you actually feel connected to the characters and you want them to be together, and you want their love to kind of, what's the word? Not maintain. you want them to make it through everything. I can't think of what the word is, but you want their love to be able to help them make it through all these hard, difficult moments that they are going to be going through. I will say I don't think the second book is as good as the first book. It's still really good, but just not quite as good. I will say the first part felt a little slow because it felt like you were reliving kind of the first book, but in reverse. So instead of Iris unknowingly writing to Roman, or Kit, or whatever you want to call him, Kit is kind of unknowingly writing to Iris. So it felt like you were kind of just doing it over again, which wasn't my favorite just because it felt slow. Like, don't get me wrong, I think you kind of had to do that because of what's happening. But yes, you do feel at first like you're slightly reliving the first book. What was also a little bit disappointing about the second is that their love story somewhat takes a back seat to the war, which is funny because I actually wanted more of the magical, like, wartime elements that you weren't really getting in the first book. I did want that, but then the way it was written, I was a little bit disappointed to see their love story kind of take a back seat. I felt like you still could have had both and it would have worked out really well. It just felt like it wasn't as powerful as the first book. And like I said, there was definitely more magic, but it just felt underwhelming still for me, as just because I do like reading the like fantasy genre, so I'm used to like basically an abundance of magic, and that just wasn't there in these books in my opinion. So again, even though there was more of it, it was still kind of just underwhelming. The other thing with the second book is I really would have liked to see more of Marisol and Keegan's love story too. More, even if it wasn't their love story, just more of them as side characters. It would have been nice to get more perspective, I think, in that sense. Not necessarily having like their chapters written in their like POVs, just nice to have them more involved. A lot of the side characters I felt like weren't overly involved. And lastly, there is something that happens at the end of this book that I felt was so unnecessary, literally so heartbreaking. And it just, again, sometimes stuff like this makes for a really good book, and I think yes, the book was great, the end was still great, even with this heartbreaking moment. It still felt unnecessary to me. I was reading it, it kind of felt like Crooked Kingdom from the Six of Crows duology, and you're kind of just like, why would you do that to me? So yeah, I do think authors like this are really good in the sense that they are willing to write things that a lot of authors maybe aren't willing to write, especially when it comes to love stories. I am keeping this as vague as I can, but yeah, there were things that happened at the end of the duology that weren't my favorite personally. Again, none of this has anything to do with her writing. I personally thought her writing and the books overall were exceptional. This was just my experience, and those were like not my favorite moments. But like I said, overall, the first book is an incredible love story that I could not put down, and I was very excited to go into the second book. The second book wraps up the duology really, really well. It just fell a little bit flat comparatively to the first book. However, it was still really good. I still was up reading. I would still recommend both. I'm just letting you guys know that the first is definitely better than the second. And I had a lot of fun reading this, as much fun as you can when these books are this emotional, and I am very happy for these imaginary characters and their love story. And if you have had this on your TBR and you're like me and you're just going to have been putting it off to the wayside, I would read it, especially if you are looking for a little more of an interesting read as far as like you don't necessarily, I'm kind of in the mood right now, I'm not gonna lie, where I want to read things that are very happy, upbeat, somewhat predictable, definitely like romances I'm enjoying. I am kind of reading fantasy too, but just a little bit more predictable. If you want something that's going to kind of keep you on your toes and you don't know what's going to happen, and an author that's kind of willing to do anything to the characters in the book, I would recommend reading this. I thought that this duology was truly exceptional. It just wasn't something that I think I would reread, and there were a couple things that I really wish she wouldn't have done. But overall, really, really great duology, and I think you guys would really like this, so I definitely would recommend it. And if you think you know someone that would also like this, be sure to share the video, let them know that they should read it right away. And if you guys have any recommendations as far as like happy-go-lucky books and books that kind of have you kicking your feet giggling, I would love to have those because I'm kind of in that mood right now. So that's where I'm at, but when I read this, it was perfect. So if you are looking for something that's going to make you feel all your feelings, I highly recommend this, and I hope you guys have a great day.